Long before the fame, long before the screaming crowds, long before the world called him the king of pop, there was a small house in Gary, Indiana. Inside that house, a frightened little boy rehearsed for hours under the watchful eyes of a father who believed weakness could destroy success. Mistakes were not tolerated. Failure was not accepted. And childhood slowly began disappearing. Years later, that same little boy would become one of the most famous human beings on earth. But behind the music, behind the moonwalk, behind the stadiums filled with millions of fans, Michael Jackson was still carrying something invisible. Fear, pressure, loneliness, and a complicated relationship with the man many people believe helped create him, while also deeply wounding him. To some people, Joe Jackson was a ruthless father who pushed his children beyond normal limits. To others, he was a disciplined parent who sacrificed everything to lift his family out of poverty. But no matter which side people believed, one thing remained impossible to deny. The relationship between Michael Jackson and his father would shape the rest of his life forever. Because this is not just the story of fame, it is the story of pressure, control, perfection, and the hidden psychological cost of creating a global superstar. This is the hidden truth about Michael Jackson and his father. Before Hollywood, before Neverland, before the world tours, there was Gary, Indiana. The Jackson family lived in a small crowded house on Jackson Street. Money was limited, the neighborhood was rough, and opportunities were rare. Joe Jackson worked long hours at a steel mill. He believed survival required discipline, strength, control, and inside the household, those beliefs shaped everything. The Jackson children grew up under strict rules. Rehearsals became daily routine. Music became obligation. Perfection became expectation. Even at a young age, Michael stood out. His voice, his rhythm, his stage presence. Joe quickly realized something important. This child was different, and according to many family accounts over the years, Joe pushed Michael relentlessly. Mistakes during rehearsals reportedly led to punishment. The children practiced for hours, repeated routines over and over. To Joe, this was preparation. To Michael, it may have felt very different. Years later, Michael would openly describe feeling frightened of his father during childhood. Not always physically, but emotionally, psychologically. He once described becoming physically sick when Joe entered the room. That statement shocked many people, because by then, Michael Jackson was already the most famous entertainer on earth. Yet emotionally, part of him still seemed trapped inside childhood memories. Joe Jackson's ambition transformed the family. The Jackson 5 began performing locally, then regionally, then nationally. Soon, record executives noticed them, and eventually, Motown changed everything. The world fell in love with young Michael Jackson. The smile, the dancing, the voice. He became the center of attention almost overnight. But while audiences saw excitement and talent, behind the scenes the pressure intensified. Schedules became brutal, travel became constant. Childhood became increasingly limited. While other children played outside, Michael rehearsed, performed, recorded, worked, and according to people close to the family, Joe maintained intense control over the group. Interviews, appearances, performances, behavior, everything had standards. That pressure helped create extraordinary success, but it also created emotional consequences that would follow Michael for decades. Because fame arrived before emotional maturity. And when childhood disappears too early, something inside people often remains unfinished. As Michael grew older, his fame exploded beyond anything the entertainment world had ever seen. Albums shattered records. Crowds screamed uncontrollably. Fans fainted. By the time Thriller dominated the world, Michael Jackson had become more than a celebrity. He became a global phenomenon. But behind the scenes, people close to him increasingly noticed emotional isolation. Michael reportedly struggled deeply with trust, self-image, identity, and many observers later connected those struggles back to childhood. Michael often spoke about feeling lonely, He described losing a normal childhood, missing simple experiences, feeling emotionally disconnected from ordinary life. At times, he appeared emotionally frozen between adulthood and childhood. And psychologically, many experts later suggested that extreme fame combined with intense childhood pressure may have created lasting emotional wounds. Meanwhile, his relationship with Joe remained complicated. There were periods of reconciliation, periods of distance, public praise, private pain. At times Michael defended his father's discipline, at other moments he described emotional suffering connected to those years. That contradiction fascinated people, because it reflected something deeply human: love and pain existing together. One of the most uncomfortable questions surrounding Joe Jackson remains this: without Joe Jackson, would Michael Jackson ever have become Michael Jackson? Some people say no. They argue Joe's discipline created greatness, that without intense structure, the Jackson children may never have escaped poverty. Others believe the emotional cost was far too high, that success built through fear leaves permanent scars. And perhaps the truth exists somewhere painfully in between, because history is filled with stories of extraordinary talent shaped by extraordinary pressure. But the Michael Jackson story feels uniquely tragic, because the world watched him become larger than life, while emotionally appearing more isolated over time. The surgeries, the anxiety, the insomnia, the search for emotional safety, the creation of Neverland Ranch. Many people later interpreted these things as attempts to reclaim a childhood he never truly experienced. And behind all of it, Joe Jackson remained a looming presence in public discussions about Michael's psychology. Neverland Ranch became one of the most symbolic places connected to Michael Jackson's life. An amusement park, animals, movie theaters, carnival rides. To some people, it looked magical. To others, it looked deeply sad, because many observers believed Neverland represented something psychologically important: a world where Michael could escape adulthood, escape pressure, escape expectations, a place where childhood could exist forever. Whether that interpretation was fully accurate or not, one thing remained clear: Michael Jackson spent much of his adult life searching for emotional peace, and despite unimaginable fame and wealth, he often appeared profoundly lonely. Meanwhile, public controversies increasingly consumed his life. Investigations, media obsession, lawsuits, constant scrutiny. The pressure became enormous, and throughout those years, people continued examining the relationship between Michael and his father, trying to understand where so much emotional complexity began. As Michael Jackson entered the final years of his life, he remained one of the most recognizable people on earth. But physically and emotionally, many observers believed he looked exhausted. Financial pressure grew, public scrutiny never disappeared, and behind closed doors, reports suggested increasing stress. Yet despite everything, Michael still prepared for another comeback. This is it, a final attempt to return to the stage. And even near the end of his life, questions surrounding childhood pressure, emotional trauma, and psychological isolation continued following him, because the world never stopped trying to understand Michael Jackson. Not just the performer, but the person underneath, the frightened child, the superstar, the lonely adult, and the complicated father-son relationship that may have shaped all of it. Today, people still fiercely debate Joe Jackson. Some view him as abusive. Others view him as misunderstood. Some believe he sacrificed everything to give his children success. Others believe the methods caused emotional damage that lasted forever. And perhaps that debate continues because the story itself feels emotionally unresolved. Because Michael Jackson became one of the greatest entertainers in human history. Yet despite the success, many people still sensed enormous sadness beneath the surface. That contradiction continues haunting audiences even years after his death. How could someone loved by millions still appear so emotionally alone? And how much of that loneliness began during childhood? In the end entity, known_celebrity, Michael Jackson, American pop singer, became more than a musician. He became a symbol of fame, perfection, pressure, and the hidden emotional cost of greatness. And behind that story stands the complicated figure of entity, people, Joe Jackson, Michael Jackson father. A father who helped create one of the most extraordinary performers the world had ever seen, but also a father connected to memories Michael himself described with fear and pain. Perhaps that is why the story still fascinates people today, because it forces uncomfortable questions. What happens when success matters more than childhood? Can greatness exist without pressure? And how much emotional damage can remain hidden behind applause? For Michael Jackson, those questions may have followed him his entire life. And even now, years after his death, the world is still trying to understand the man behind the music. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to True Crime Story Vault for more psychological documentaries, hidden celebrity stories, disturbing investigations, courtroom mysteries, and dark untold stories behind fame. And remember, sometimes the greatest performances hide the deepest pain.